Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We are going to start with a webinar and talk about the future of multilateralism. In today's webinar, we have Simon Evenett, who is a professor of international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen. And Simon has written a book together with Richard Baldwin, a CPR press ebook called Revitalizing Multilateralism. And it describes pragmatic ideas for the new WTO Director General. And so the book has, I think the book is fairly known and by now. And the book discusses with 21 chapters all sorts of trade ideas and proposals from various trade aspects of how to improve and develop and revitalize multilateralism. And this book also gives very pragmatic ideas for the new Director General. The book is not short of any pragmatic proposals, and these are then also the issues that we are going to discuss today. So, Simon, very welcome to this webinar. I must also say that for all the participants that we have here today, there is a chance to ask questions in the chat box that you will see here on this screen too. I must also say that we have quite a few participants today. So there were like 250 people signed up today. So we don't really have time to for all the questions that are coming in. But nonetheless, please do ask questions because we do have time for more than some of them. And so any question that you might have, are very welcome, but we might not, have time to ask them all, but please do come in. So I will start off this webinar asking a few questions, and then we just go forward, Simon, and most likely other questions will come in. So first, I would like to sort of start with the overall sort of notion that the book already quite in the beginning puts forward, that is the notion of a crisis. So because that's something that the book does state from the very beginning. And it states that, there is this crisis in terms of trade and for the world trading system. Now, and if you take a step back and if you think about this notion of crisis, you can only conclude that we have had quite a few in recent years. We have, the US retreat from multilateralism, we have Trump's tariff war, we have the two major crises, as you also described, over the last 15 years, of course, the global financial crisis, and now we have COVID. Meanwhile, we see that Doha hasn't worked. There is also in the background this increased inequality that many people blame that globalization is responsible for. We also see many PTAs coming up where things are happening. So altogether, you could say, there is a lot of reason for pessimism at the WTO. And yet, in your book, already very explicitly from the beginning, you say, no, that's not the case. Could you explain why we shouldn't be so pessimistic about it?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this webinar and to share some thoughts with colleagues. Let me put my current optimism in context. If you go back to 15 years or so to the Doha round, when everyone was saying, this is going to happen, we're going to do it, let's keep the momentum up, I'm afraid I was one of the first people to turn around and say, I don't see the pieces falling into place. And so back then I was concerned that actually the consensus view or the conventional wisdom was wrong about being able to successfully conclude that round. And now I have a similar feeling that the sort of conventional wisdom of doom and gloom is overdone as well. And I would highlight a number of points. And by the way, I don't want to deny the setbacks that we've seen here. The trade war was terrible. It was essentially one major power revoking MFN status on another and quote, getting away with it as far as WTO rules were concerned. And we have had the two big global economic crises that we've faced as well. So I don't want to downplay the problems, but I think we should also balance that out by recognizing that over the last 10 years, about a third of all trade policy changes we've seen have been liberalizing. They've actually opened up markets. Those are the unilateral policy changes. We have had a number of regional trade agreements signed. There has been, I think, a loss of momentum behind them, but we still do occasionally have big agreements being signed like RCEP. We are seeing countries collaborate in investment areas. And of course, we have the EU-China Accord as well. And so when I look at the world, it's true that there's a lot of downside, and downside, of course, sells well. It gets good media headlines, it gets good social media headlines, but there's also quite a lot of unilateral reform going on. Countries haven't lost the knack for that. Some countries haven't lost the knack for collaboration in terms of either sectoral initiatives or regional initiatives and the like. And of course, even at the WTO, once we've run into trouble with the multilateral approach, countries have also tried to go ahead on these joint statement initiatives, which of course are coalitions of the willing. So, countries countries who want to move forward have come forward and identify areas where they want to collaborate. And of course, in the area of dispute settlement, where we have a problem too, we have a group of countries which have come up with what they might think of as an interim measure. It may end up being more permanent, but at least they have responded. So I would urge people to see the entire canvas. There are storm clouds, there is thunder and lightning, but there's also good news as well. And so I think Richard and I were keen on asking, okay, if there is this good news, and there is this good news, how could we capitalize on this? Furthermore, the context of the pandemic offers, in our view, an opportunity for the trading system to demonstrate that it can deliver in an important non-economic area, an important social area, such as the delivery of PPE, the delivery of vaccines and the like. And so when you look at what could happen this year in 2021, this could be a year where the WTO members, if they got their act together, could take a number of steps which demonstrate to prime ministers and presidents that the WTO is a place where stuff still happens and things get done, constructive things get done. So again, to go back to where I started, I don't typically follow the conventional wisdom on where trade policy discussions are at. And I think as we went through last year, it seemed to me there were opportunities available and and a few triggers of potential change, such as the incoming Biden administration, as well as a new director general coming in, which could tip the balance back towards a more positive direction and prospect for the WTO. And what Richard and I wanted to do was to put together a group of experts, and you were of course one of them, who could help us talk through what those steps could be in the short term and the medium term to help us get there. And that was the spirit in which we approached this ebook.
Yeah, so if I may sort of take a step sort of forward and try to be a bit more, what is the word, like provocative here, if I may. I mean, because, so you're saying that there's still enough engine to, get this forward and to revitalize multilateralism. But if you look around, you could also say, well, maybe there is not sort of so much optimism. Because, on top of what I already said before, there is this slowing speed of globalization, right? So there's this new discussion coming up, whether it's deglobalization or a slowing pace. If you look at some of the surveys, particularly here in Europe, like for instance, what I also found is that the Eurobarometer, the latest one, says that 75% of the people that responded, of the European people, prefer to shift to local providers instead of trade. As you said, the new US administration is likely, well, it hopefully will come forward and do something about, multilateralism and fix some of these points that it has done in the last couple of years. But, it's also very likely maybe to focus on domestic policies rather than trade. So, again, I would sort of try to put forward the question, why then is it worthwhile to fix the WTO right now, like in current times? And why not wait for a couple of years? And on top of that, do policymakers and sort of G20 leaders also see that need to revitalize the WTO right now, as soon as there is a new director general coming in?
Okay, so let me come come at this in a number of ways. I think the concern of waiting. So let's put on the table the options, right? We could do nothing or wait. Doing nothing or waiting is not going to fix problems, and we will not have a predictable framework for the development of digital trade. Doing nothing would also open the door to countries taking unilateral steps in the area of climate change and border tax adjustments, which could end up further inflaming things. So I think not talking and not working together isn't going to help issues. Having said that, I fully understand why prime ministers, presidents, and their advisors could just roll their eyes when they hear, "Let's try and do something to fix the WTO." I mean, in fact, my mind goes back about 5 years ago when one G7 government came to me and said, "What new messages can we share about multilateralism? And please don't mention the Doha round." There was a sense that the WTO had shot its bolt on that one, and that this system was not as credible as it could be. Yet at the same, so I understand that the starting point is one of considerable skepticism. Yet at the same time, I would see potential opportunities here as well, which is, I mentioned earlier, we've got to rationally and try and, in a least disruptive way possible, distribute a huge amount of vaccine across the world in the next year, and that's going to require quite a range of different trade policy related matters which could come up. I think there is a desire to rethink where supply chains could go and where the WTO could contribute to the resilience of supply chains as well. We have to get shipping back together, get back working, and airlines back working as well. I mean, we have incredible restrictions at ports and on seafarers leaving ships. And so when I look at the next sort of 6 to 12 months, there, in terms of getting the world economy and the world trading system back on its feet, there is a possibility there. There's plenty to be done there. Mm. The question then is whether we can encourage enough governments to come together with proposals that gain some momentum, and then whether that momentum shows to the prime ministers and presidents, or actually maybe we oversold the WTO. Maybe actually it is quite useful. I think instinctively, when you deal with a lot of countries, senior officials, I mean, I don't get the sense that there are many senior officials who want to bury the WTO. There are a few people in the current White House who might want to do that. But once you get outside of there, I think there are a lot of people who'd like to see this organization succeed, but they're not going to attach much time and effort to arguing for that, given the lousy track record of the last 10 years. Right? I get that. But what I want to suggest to you is that there's an opportunity going forward in terms of showing the WTO in a positive light. And then there are some structural issues we have got to help define the rules of the road for: digital trade, climate change. And then there's another really important factor we have to deal with, which is that we have different types of capitalism now, some state-led, some market-led, and we need to find some way in which those forms of capitalism can get along with one another, or at least rub along without causing too much friction and discord. So there's a lot to be done, and we don't have to do it immediately. We don't have to, this is not the time, I think, for someone to put out a massive blueprint. Instead, it's more a matter of baby steps, which hopefully build confidence, and then on top of that, which we can build on. So I see it in those terms, rather than either complete pessimism and nihilism, giving up on the WTO, or one of these sort of blue sky exercises where someone comes up and wants to recreate the entire system. I see no appetite for that either. But I would argue, based on what we saw last year with a number of countries coming forward at the WTO with ideas about how to collaborate, that there is some interest in it. And it may not carry all of the WTO membership, but in my view, it doesn't have to.
All right, okay. I'll come back in a couple of minutes about, the sort of issues that you brought up, like climate change, digital economy. And also because I already see that we also have one question related to this. But before I get there, I would like to sort of ask a different question, because you mentioned the sort of structural element of the WTO. And that implies a little bit of a longer term sort of perspective. And regarding that, I mean, in your book, in your first chapter, you also talk about like the common purpose and the common means across WTO members. And so that implies, you know, a sort of a longer term approach that is necessary to find that sort of common purpose and then the means to realize these purposes. So again, if I play devil's advocate here, I mean, one could also argue, well, you know, these common purposes, as you also mentioned, they differ widely across WTO members. Mm-hmm. And that could make it difficult to get back, you know, to get the WTO back on track. I mean, after the global or after the COVID-19 crisis, and to make the WTO relevant again post-COVID. And so then my question is, I mean, could you tell us more about these shared goals across WTO members? Maybe also why they vary across WTO members? And what I'm actually even more curious about as a third sort of sub-question here is, what have you found then, given that these purposes vary so much? What is the largest sort of, what is the purpose that finds largest common grounds across these WTO members?
Okay, thank you. We framed it slightly differently. Richard and I argued in the following way, which is that once the confidence building measures that I just talked about earlier were underway, we would encourage the members of the WTO, in particular their senior diplomats in Geneva, to ask the question, what do we want this organization to do over the next 5 or 10 years, say 10 years? Now that question is different from the question which they've previously been asking, right? If you look at the Riyadh initiative, which the Saudis organized in their G20 presidency, it was, you know, what values can we agree on? Which is a slightly different question, because values, you can always say, I sign up to this. Asking the question, where do you want to go, forces you to think about, or where do you want the WTO to go, forces you to think about which imperatives should drive this system. The next step in our argument was to say, well, look, what have we heard from diplomats talking about imperatives at the WTO? And we heard probably 6 or 7, and then we would add an 8th, okay? The first imperative is the oldest one, which is that countries want to use, the WTO should help countries integrate international, into global markets, whether on their own or regionally or multilaterally. That's an old imperative. Another imperative is to limit uncertainty in international trade. That's why we have bindings on tariffs and things like this. A third imperative is to encourage countries to reform their economies in a market-based way. Now, this is where, you know, this is one of the, you know, flashpoints, because for sure the Americans want this. Often one hears European officials stating this. But you don't hear the Chinese arguing for that at all, right? They don't see the WTO as advancing a particular economic or development model. Yeah. The fourth imperative is one which used to be really important at the GATT, but is now, I think, coming back, is how do you manage the clash between different systems or different types of capitalism? The fifth imperative is how should countries manage disruptions which happen inevitably when you have import surges and the like. What's the right way to manage those disruptions without tearing up the system? The sixth imperative is one we've accepted since the Uruguay round. How do we encourage compliance? And the seventh imperative is, how does this organization stay relevant as the world economy changes? We've already talked about digital, climate change and the like. And the eighth imperative, which Richard and I put on the table, is how can this organization better manage crises, right? Given that we have many of them. Now, when you listen to different diplomats and you read what they have to say, and also what scholars have to say, analysts have to say, you see a lot of different emphasis on this, right? You asked me where are the areas of commonality. Yeah. There's probably an appreciation that the disruption imperative. We need some way in which countries can respond to disruptions without throwing out the whole body of rules. So that's probably an area. I think if you talked about the integration imperative, that is getting countries to integrate more into global markets, countries might differ in terms of the speed, but the idea that there should be a framework to guide how countries do that. is probably not terribly controversial. The idea of limiting uncertainty in trade through bindings alike, probably not uncontroversial as well. The market reform imperative, very controversial. Systems clash used to be understood as an important imperative, probably will gain in importance. And you can go down the list here, and I think what Richard and I were suggesting was maybe a series of quiet conversations need to happen in Geneva to identify where is what's the largest common denominator, which keeps the major powers on board, and then maybe the WTO works in those areas over the next 5 or 10 years on a multilateral basis if they can. And then if countries have additional imperatives they want to follow, then maybe they have to be done on a plurilateral basis or outside of the WTO.
Yeah.
But I think framing that discussion in terms of where do you want this organization to go in the next, or what do you want it to do in the next 5 or 10 years, is more useful than asking, okay, what values do we share and alike? Because the emphasis should really be on getting this organization going again, much in the spirit of the arguments I made earlier, so that we can restore the credibility of this organization.
Yeah, no, and I mean there are certain issues that should be done at the WTO, as you pointed out in the previous question. So this pragmatic approach, I mean, seems more than very reasonable. I would say definitely. I also would like to talk about not so much like these values or imperatives, but I mean, you also talk about the underlying shifts in the global economy in your book, and I think that sort of ties in with the imperatives but also the sort of pragmatic ideas that where you would like the WTO to move forward in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, these underlying shifts, I mean, you talk about are, of course, climate change, energy transitions, and also very notably the digital economy. Also, what you have is, the ramifications, the economic cost as a result of COVID that you have in this crisis. Now, I mean, if you put this all together, wouldn't there be also a danger looming around the corner here that, I mean, although you might move forward in the next 5 to 10 years, with a more pragmatic approach across WTO members where the WTO wants to be, but then these imperatives because of these underlying shifts will just further drift apart? Is there a danger? Is there a risk for seeing that? And if so, what will be the solution there? Is there a short-term quick fix in your mind?
Okay, I want to start off by framing what you've said slightly differently. What we've tried to do in our discussion about identifying imperatives is trying to find reasons for countries to come together or groups of countries to come together so that they can take actions which take the organization forward. So those are your centripetal forces, the ones which bring people together. There are forces which, of course, which could break or further increase the divisions between countries, right? And in each of the areas that you've described, it's quite possible to draw scenarios where big blocks of countries or countries are at odds with one another. So let's take the area you know very well, which is the digital economy. The very fact that Europe has so few leading large digital companies, I suspect materially influences how it is addressing issues to do with regulation and taxation of big tech, right? And likewise, the United States, flip it around. They have so many based there. And so you can find fault lines for sure, okay? And you could find all sorts of reasons why this could go wrong, okay? But then I think, that could lead to the Council of Despair. And I think it's, if you're scoping out the potential scenarios for the WTO, one has to put those types of bad scenarios or unfortunate scenarios on the table. But do we have to accept that? Could we do better than that? Well, let's take the case of digital. Most countries have some interest in privacy for their citizens. We increasingly see a sort of freedom of speech dimension to some of the social media companies' actions. There's also a very important taxation dimension. And that taxation dimension will become even more important once countries realize they have to start getting their public finances in order after the pandemic is over. Yeah. And so there's enough sort of there again, those are imperatives, like how to protect the privacy of people, how to protect free speech, how to ensure that that there's enough money flowing into treasuries to be able to keep public services going, and that everyone's paying or each sector is paying some type of a reasonable share. These could well become commonly shared imperatives, which then structure cooperation. So, if I were sketching out the scenarios, I can paint some pretty bleak pictures, but in a world where creative officials wanted to get together and structure some initiatives which could take things forward, there would be conversations there where I think there'll be probably more common ground on some imperatives than people might think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it all goes back to where I started off this conversation. The conventional wisdom at the moment is very gloomy about multilateralism in general, and trade multilateralism is in particular. But it doesn't. But maybe that's been overdone, and maybe if we had some very constructive officials working certainly on both sides of the Atlantic, and ideally also with officials in the large emerging markets, then maybe there are some areas where you can go forward. And I'm not saying this amounts to a massive new blueprint, but it's certainly less pessimistic than the doom and gloom that one needs to come to.
Yeah. So building upon on this answer and this question, because as you said, like with these underlying shifts or these structural changes in the economy that we see, new issues will come up. So you mentioned the digital economy, you mentioned like digital tax, you also mentioned in the book the border tax adjustments. So these are new sort of policy issues that will come along with the changing global economy as a result of these underlying shifts, and that will probably have to be discussed at the WTO. At the same time, you also talk about these benefits, and I think it's very nicely put in the book that you talk about these three benefits. The absolute benefit of just trade liberalization. Trade gives you a benefit. Stop. There is also, as a second type of benefit, this relative benefit. So I gain, but my trading partner also gains. So what is the relative implication there? What is my motivation there to get myself sitting around the negotiation table? And then the third benefit is that you also talk about tempering sort of commitments for trade liberalization for unforeseen events. I mean, that I think is also very well known. So you suspend commitment temporarily in order, to come back later on at the WTO and to realize that that's also in itself like a benefit. Now, if you put these benefits next to each other, I mean, they work sort of together. How, with these new policy issue areas that will come up, how can we sort of make sure that, these benefits are realized for WTO members in the future with these new policy issue coming up? And how can we make sure that, these benefits remain a benefit for WTO members, given that they sort of are dependent on each other? Could you tell us a little bit more about that and your thoughts?
I mean, I'd like to amplify the ideas there, and let me start by saying here, Richard and I found the Alan Wolf, who is the number 2 at the WTO, his way of looking at this problem, I think, very useful. So Alan argued that a WTO member looks at the benefits of its membership along the 3 dimensions you talked about. Is my country or economy gaining from membership? Is it gaining enough relative to how much everyone else is gaining? And do I have the flexibility to be able to respond to shocks when they happen? And I'm not too constrained in how I do that, given that there are political imperatives at home. And so Alan's 3-part breakdown, I think, is really helpful, especially when you look forward into these trends that you've identified. So let's take the case of climate change. Right? Imagine we have a country or a group of countries like the EU, which decide to unilaterally put in place a series of border measures which seek to appropriately tax carbon use. and whether it does so equally to domestic versus foreign. Foreign producers, of course, will be the key trade problem. But you can imagine a jurisdiction which is serious about climate change saying that we need to take this action. And of course, to the extent that those border measures then alter access to the markets of the countries which are, or the jurisdiction which has put those measures in place, then other countries may turn around and say, well, actually, our overall benefit from being in the system is being affected here. Okay. And you can imagine exporters of goods which use huge amounts of energy being particularly concerned about border tax adjustments, for example, and the like. Yeah. And so that's a good example of how something, a first order social challenge leads to a policy intervention, which on the face of it sounds like a good thing to do, but which has big implications for how a country looks at its WTO membership. A second trend which is worth thinking about here, and this has to do with the relative benefits of WTO membership. Let's take the rise of China, and also if you want to take even the rise of India in the world economy. These economies are now, both India and China, are selling more and more abroad. China, of course, has done extraordinarily well in this respect. And so it's not unreasonable, I think, for other countries to turn around and say, well, look, my country's gains from this system are now relatively smaller compared to what China's were. And that the Chinese economy and the Chinese government and people are benefiting much more from this system than in the past, and that the system then has become imbalanced. Now, what you do and how you negotiate your way out of that and where you go next, I think is a separate question. But the notion that the rule book, which was put in place 27 years ago, agreed 27 years ago, I mean, that generated at the time a series of benefits which presumably governments were happy with, otherwise they wouldn't have agreed to create the WTO. But that balance of benefits, I think, has shifted quite markedly with the rise of the emerging markets. It's shifting markedly with the spread of digital technologies in some economies more than others, and it will also change with as countries react to climate change as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, as we go forward in the next 5 or 10 years, more and more countries do come back and ask themselves, well, what's the relative benefits and costs of being in this organization? Not because they want to leave the organization, but because things have changed. Then I think we get to the interesting point, which is that, are we all going to sit on our hands and turn around and say, well, look, we agreed these rules in 1993, and for the last 25 years, those are the rules of the game, and we're not prepared to change them? Or do we turn around and start saying, look, the balance has changed. We need to keep as many countries on board and in the system as we can, engage, not unhappy, not sour members, active, positive members, in which case we need to have a discussion about how to rebalance the benefits of membership across countries. And that's a discussion which I think is almost, let's just put it this way, if it doesn't happen, then we will end up with more of these sour and disengaged WTO members.
Yeah.
And that's the downside risk. So I think anyone who wants to chart an alternative, more positive course has to wake up to the fact that the relative benefits and the absolute benefits and the perception of those benefits is shifting and has shifted markedly.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. And but I do want to have that discussion here already. I mean, in terms of, these changes are there. So there has been this change. Should then, in order to harness these benefits or realize these benefits, should there also be change then in the organization of the WTO, right? So is there a case to get rid of some of these constraints then of the WTO precisely to accommodate these changes that you're describing?
Okay, so you call them constraints. Maybe I would put, the constraints may be formal constraints or legal constraints, but I think perhaps the more important constraint is how we think about these problems, right? So, yeah. And I think our mode of thinking needs to change, right? So the classic sort of Uruguay round way of thinking about every problem was, a problem is only solved if it's codified in a trade agreement, multilateral accord, which includes everyone all signing up to the same levels of obligations, and that those obligations are enforceable with a credible system of dispute settlement, right? And that's the mindset which I think has pervaded much of the last 25 years. I think the Doha Round negotiations showed that quite frankly, there are not enough governments in the world who are willing to sign up to that model anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so then we are left with essentially approaches which do not involve single undertakings. We are left then with coalitions of the willing moving ahead in plurilaterals. And we need to figure out what are the rules for how countries can move ahead in plurilaterals without necessarily harming other countries that don't want to do so. So that's one area where I think we really, that's one thing which will have to change. We will also, I think, have to figure out whether or not the current system of managing disruptions, which are, if you think of import surges or dumped subsidized imports, things like this, the whole trade defense architecture, which is in the WTO, clearly that's not enough to allay American and other countries' worries about Chinese subsidization. So what mechanism do we need there to enable Chinese capitalism to continue in the way it is and minimize or reduce the number of conflicts with other countries? So we're going to have to think about those mechanisms for managing disruption. That's another area which is clearly going to require a lot of work. And since we are moving into, and the world has gone so far beyond trading goods, we have not just trade in services, we also have digital trade, FDI and alike, then a whole series of similar mechanisms are being developed in those areas too. So, in the area of FDI, we've seen in the last 2 years a huge spread in the number of investment screening mechanisms, which is just another way of managing the clashes between different types of capitalism, often wrapped up in national security grounds, but let's not be, no one's fooled by that. And then in the area of digital trade, we have, rather than countries trying to find ways to manage sort of differences, countries working at different speeds in this area, we've had a lot of countries trying to shut down cross-border transmission of data or limit or condition it. And again, is this the smartest way to handle these particular problems? So again, I think that there's a lot of work to be done. But I think, to be honest, I think the one thing we've really got to jettison is a lot of the Uruguay round thinking, single undertaking, everything has to be hard law enforceable by dispute settlement. The system was never really that tight in the first place, but that way of thinking about things is not very helpful.
Yeah. You and Richard talk about like the shackles. I put them. I sort of use the word constraint, but I guess a better word there is than to.
Shackles is more provocative, I think.
Sorry?
Shackles is more provocative, and the word was deliberately chosen to try and get colleagues whose default position is to think about the Uruguay round solutions to problems to think again. And I think those people are sufficiently creative that they'll find alternative ways forward.
So, just to follow up on this, and then I think I'm gonna sort of include some of the questions that are coming in, which I think is very good. And please do, all listeners, come in. I'll get back to you in a minute. So, about these constrained shackles that you'll talk about, and you mentioned this one word, like the appellate body. Could you elaborate on that? How do you see that as a shackle? What are the implications then if you don't want to sort of alleviate that constraint?
Right. I think this is a great question, and I need to start off with a sort of professional disclaimer, which is that I'm an economist, not a lawyer, but I have watched what's gone on for the last 20 years with incredible interest, and I think the view amongst more and more of us is that the way in which the rules-based system was implemented, especially the DSU part of it, was suboptimal. Basically, there are many of us who think that the appellate body, in many respects, has blown it. Okay, and I think you can take the position that a number of the appellate body drew the wrong lines on a number of cases without being against a rules-based system, right? And here, we were preparing the ebook, I was trying to think about what's a right way of thinking about this, and I went back to the writings of John Jackson, who was, of course, one of the fathers of the WTO, and also, by the way, a former colleague of mine at the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And Jackson was very careful to say when the WTO was created that we need a system that is rule-oriented but not rule-based. And he also highlighted that often rule orientation and a rule-based system will look very similar. But he was under no illusion that a rules-based system would at some point run into opposition from democratically elected politicians who would turn around and say, I mean, John wouldn't put the point this way, I will. Politicians would say, well, who the hell are these judges in Geneva? And so Jackson, he understood that it was a difficult balancing act. We want a system where rules are ideally respected, where the value of them, intrinsic value of them, is understood. We do need a system for dealing with disputes between countries, but we cannot have an overly prescriptive system. Now, as we've talked about this, given webinars on this ebook around the world, it's interesting listening to some people I think are very genuine supporters of rule-based international governance, who have been prepared to concede that one of the problems with the way that the appellate body did things is that it's now forced negotiators to be very cautious about whatever they sign up at the WTO. So they want to know, what does it mean if you put a comma here, or if you don't put a comma here, if you put a semicolon here. Now, okay, negotiators are there to do, they should be doing their drafting job properly and seriously, right? But I think their jobs are hard enough trying to find middle ground without having to worry about how their views, what they agree is going to be second and third guessed down the road by a group of judges. And I think that's where we've got to. I think on this overall, no, I don't think anyone's arguing for abandonment of rules or the abandonment of dispute settlement. But we need to find another formula, because the current formula evidently has lost support. And by the way, it's not just a matter of losing support amongst in the United States, where it has comprehensively lost support. There are a number of other jurisdictions which have, or WTO members, which have articulated real concerns about the operation of this system. And so something has gone horribly wrong. And I think we need to have a really creative discussion. And here, I mean, the lawyers are much better placed than economists like me to try and think through what are alternatives ways of resolving disputes which don't replicate the same mistakes, but which still generate some degree of confidence and security to members of the WTO.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, I mean, there are a couple of questions coming in regarding this point and precisely regarding resolving this issue, as you talked about. I mean, here literally there is a question saying, the appellate body crisis perhaps is most important issue solving the WTO and putting the organization back on track, okay? And then here it comes, moreover, wouldn't you then, Simon, agree, or what are your thoughts regarding this? That this will have, resolving the issue of the appellate body, a positive impact to get the US and the EU closer towards having a dialogue towards addressing China's non-market behavior. What are your thoughts regarding that?
I must tell you, I really dislike the way in which the questioner has framed this issue. And maybe we should be open about our areas of disagreement. So let me put that on the table. The statement, the appellate body crisis is perhaps the most important issues facing the WTO. It's clearly a problem, but I think even if we fix the appellate body crisis, and if the WTO didn't do anything on climate change or on the digital economy, I would see this organization as a depreciating asset anyway. But it's not clear to me that privileging the appellate body crisis is the right way to think about this at all. And the other concern I really have is that I don't think we're going to be able to fix the appellate body crisis without thinking through how certain obligations are structured at the WTO, especially those which relate to how countries deal with disruptions, in particular trade defense, safeguards, and the like. So I don't think we can fix the appellate body without fixing those obligations either. So again, this is one of these points where I think just compartmentalizing the problem as an appellate body problem is the wrong way to look at it. I'm not suggesting that that's what the questionnaire has said, but it comes very close to this. Yeah. Let's turn to the second point here, which is to do with dealing with China's non-market behavior. I mean, China clearly has a state-driven capitalist system. They're very open about it. The balance between states and markets is different from other countries, or at least from many of the Western nations. But even in the West, we have quite substantial state intervention in our economies. And rather than sort of thinking about these issues in a binary way, state capitalism or not, maybe we should be thinking about economies along a continuum of more or less state intervention. And maybe it would be more useful to think about which types of state intervention are ones which cause greatest concern for trading partners because they create adverse spillovers for those trading partners. So for me, orienting it around China's non-market behavior is not the right way to look at the problem. I think what we should be doing is looking across different types of state intervention and asking which ones generate the largest cross-border spillovers. Here. Now, I must tell you, my thinking on this was heavily influenced by the debate a few years ago about steel excess capacity in the steel sector. Now, I don't deny that there's excess capacity in the Chinese steel sector. I think the interesting question is, what's the evidence that that's had a dramatic adverse impact on the rest of the world? And what depressed me was that whenever I laid out a potential theory of harm based on what officials had said and what the industry had said, and then when you took those lines of argument and confronted them with data, there was very little empirical evidence to support the case that there were major adverse cross-border spillovers. And I think that's an important point, which is increasingly being accepted, certainly amongst economists, is that a country can have stupid policies. China can have as many steel plants as it likes, but it's only when those steel plants produce goods which are then shipped abroad or depress excessively prices in the Chinese market that we have a problem, and then we need to figure out how do we relate to that particular cross-border spillover in a way. That's the right way to think about this. Okay, yeah. We're going to need to think about these things differently because let's take another area, a completely different one, not steel. You've heard a lot of policymakers argue in the last 12 months that countries need to rely more on their own firms for supplying medical goods and equipment. You've even heard some policymakers argue that firms in those sectors, medical equipment, medical goods sectors, need to maintain excess levels of capacity so as to be able to deal with unexpected shocks. Well, that's another excess capacity story, just like the Chinese steel excess capacity story. Okay? If we're going to come up with rules of the road which are going to be applied uniformly across sectors, then we need to start thinking about what's the cross-border harm done by each of these measures, not just labeling countries according to their development models, which I don't think is a very useful way of looking at this particular problem.
So it's really looking at the consequences, what they cause, basically.
Sure. I mean, my view is if the Chinese government wants to build a huge numbers of steel plants and the like, and if they want to distort and allocate the resources in their own country, that's unfortunate for the well-being of the Chinese people. So I would argue to officials in Beijing, maybe that's not the smartest policy for China, but it only becomes a trade problem when there's a cross-border spillover.
Yeah.
And I'm not denying that there can be those spillovers, but I think the focus needs to be on those spillovers, not on just the very fact that excess capacity has been built in a certain place. Yep.
I'll come back to this issue in a couple of minutes about, these two forms or these two systems. But meanwhile, I mean, sticking to this point of the appellate body, we also got a question coming in asking, why didn't the US just engage in finding a creative solution or a discussion rather than criticizing and rejecting?
I think, again, this is I'm going to give you my assessment of what I thought the Trump administration was trying to do there. I don't think they were interested in finding solutions and in the WTO going forward. To be honest, I think they were quite happy with, I think they would have liked a very different type of WTO. The WTO they had was not one of their liking. I don't think they saw that any effort and mileage in trying to persuade other countries to change. And so essentially they criticized and offered no constructive contributions. So they were certainly not part of the solution. They did highlight some important deficiencies, I think, but they were certainly unconstructive in terms of how to fix the WTO. And that's because I'm not sure they wanted to fix it.
You think, I mean, as an add-on question, this is likely to change with the new administration?
Okay, so the signals we received here are quite qualified, and we have to be very careful here. And a number of colleagues have rightly made the argument that we shouldn't expect too much from the Biden administration. In my way of thinking about this is, I don't think the Biden administration will go out of its way to do the type of harm that the Trump administration has. Okay? In terms of, on the downside risks are, the potential of harming the system is much lower. But in terms of taking the system forward, I think we should be very cautious about what we expect from the Biden administration. Maybe they will, they'll acquiesce to the appointment of a new director general of the WTO. Maybe they'll agree to some type of fix with the dispute settlement, but it won't be particularly path-breaking. But we've had a very strong signal from President Biden. He's not in the market for trade liberalization. He doesn't want deals which liberalize markets. He wants to rebuild American competitiveness first. He's been very explicit about this. So, if you're looking for deals which break open markets and all the rest of it, that's not going to happen during the first term of a Democratic presidency. It may happen in the second term, but not in the first term. Certainly not on a multilateral basis. But that doesn't mean then that there aren't other forms of cooperation that are possible, especially in the area of medical goods. The Biden administration is very interested in climate change. So to the extent that trade policy can be seen to support the climate change goals, that would be valuable too. So I think there's a domain of area, there's a set of areas where dialogue could happen, but I'm not expecting anything transformative. But to be honest, as I argued earlier, in order to turn the corner here, what we need actually are shorter term confidence building initiatives. We don't need a brand new blueprint for the WTO. We need to get this organization back on its feet and moving forward. And so smaller incremental steps in the near term, which a Biden administration could go along with, would be helpful.
Yeah, that's very clear. I also would like to come back to the two systems that you talk about of capitalism, because there was also one or two questions about this issue. So you do mention this in the book. I mean, there is these two systems of capitalism within, the WTO. And I mean, as you also point out already, I mean, these two different systems are not just, systems from any kind of member. No, these are from two major members that are very influential, that are massive, that each have a massive economy. And so they're very powerful. Now, still, so you argue, you make the point that these two capitalist approaches, I mean, there is a need for them to coexist. But given the fact that these systems are very different, and coming from these two very different economies, they also have very different interests, one could argue, in the trading system. And so wouldn't that sort of, hurt, these short-term confidence-building measures there? I mean, is there enough common ground between the two capitalist approaches in order to coexist? And what are these? So, and then that's one block of that sort of question that I would put out there. So, and if maybe for the short term, for these confidence building measures, I mean, there is enough sort of argument to say, well, they need to coexist and they are likely to be able to coexist. What about this long term? So if you go back to these imperatives, for example, or the purposes, I mean, wouldn't there be sort of a threat for these two systems of, again, very powerful members to coexist? Is that possible?
Okay, let me answer this. I think there's probably more of a problem in the longer term than the shorter term. Is the one sentence answer. Let me try and explain why. We have these different systems of capitalism, and again, I don't like the binary distinctions. I think we should think along a continuum, because we have a hell of a lot of subsidization which goes on in in Western Europe and North America as well.
Yeah.
And I think these systems, they are different, but so what? And the so what comes down to, well, here we have to, instead of allowing our fears to get out of control, we have to ask ourselves the question, which practices in the different types of capitalism create these adverse cross-border spillovers, right? So I mentioned earlier excess capacity in Chinese manufacturing, okay? Well, what we need to be able to do is to, for each one of these concerns, identify what are the cross-border spillovers, what's the harm done, and how big is that harm? And then what are the least disruptive ways of trying to remedy that harm, right? That's the right way, I think, to approach this particular problem. Now, then let's relate this to the cooperation short-term and long-term. If you think about the short-term cooperation, one area where the leading members of the WTO could get together would be to sign a memorandum of understanding on medical goods. And this has been proposed by the European Union. The United Kingdom is very much in support of it. There were earlier ideas, great ideas from New Zealand and from Singapore. These are areas where, this is an area where, quite frankly, we don't really touch on the different types of capitalism at all. So that's an issue which one could take forward without there being too much of a problem. So then, another area where the WTO members might want to think about is, well, to what extent can the WTO ramp up its own organizational response to crises in terms of the information it gathers, how it organizes meetings, how it gets people together, how it liaises with other organizations. I mean, again, this is somewhat independent of the questions of different types of capitalism. So there's in short, there's a class of short-term confidence building measures which I think can be taken, which don't fall foul of this clash of systems. Now, let's think even a little bit more ambitiously, which is that after this crisis, after the corona pandemic is over, or as we go through it, we are going to run into public finance problems. So countries are going to need to be able to cut back on subsidies and spending and alike. And in the past, when we've had instances like this, these have been quite good opportunities to rein in state support for companies. Right? Now, if you work on the assumption that no one in Beijing likes wasting money on inefficient companies, and no one in Washington does either, and no one in Brussels does either, if that's a starting point here, then we might begin to think, right, okay, what type of initiative could we take to begin to unwind and scale back those subsidies? And again, one can think very formally about this in terms of a binding accord, or maybe actually what we just need is sustained progress in this area in a much more looser arrangement. So again, I think that's an area where potentially, if countries frame the issue in terms of how do we make trade policy support an important imperative of sound public finances, we might be able to make progress. Where it will be harder, and this is where I'll come to the long-term imperatives, let's take the imperative that the WTO exists to encourage its members to adopt more and more market-based economic governance. I mean, it's quite clear China has absolutely no interest in that. I mean, that viewpoint, I think, would find no favor in Beijing. Okay, if you push that viewpoint in Brussels very hard, you might find much more opposition than you realize. That goes back to the sort of shifting public opinion and NGO pressure, which you hinted at earlier. Okay, so there are some imperatives and some organizing logics for the WTO over the longer term, which are probably going to have to fall by the wayside once you realize that China is not going away and it's probably not going to adopt a market-based system very quickly. Other longer term imperatives, like having a system which limits uncertainty in trade policy and supports trade flows. I mean, I can't understand why the big players couldn't agree with that. Having a system which lets countries that do want to integrate further into world markets to go ahead and do so on their own speed, as long as they respect certain rules. Who could be against that? Right? After all, China and the US do liberalize their policies as well, trade policies as well. So when you look down the list of 8 imperatives that we talked about, some of them would survive a system where a situation where there's a lot of systems clash between different types of capitalism, and some would not. But I don't think it destroys all of them at all.
And the likelihood, for example, you know, in a sort of more applicable terms of these new issue areas that come up, like if you think about, you know, border tax adjustments and digital services tax or data localization or data related, you know, restrictions, are these two systems not too far apart, or is there enough sort of common ground to solve these issues for members?
On digital, there's a lot. I mean, and you know this area better than me. There it does seem to me to be a lot of distance between countries and growing distance as well. So this might be an area where at first there is, you know, it doesn't look very promising. But again, I think the right lenses, what we need in the sort of digital trade space is a much better understanding of exactly what countries are doing, the costs of what they're doing, both domestically and internationally, and what opportunities are being lost, right? There's a huge amount in terms of factual evidence collection which is needed there. Now, of course, ECIPE did great work with the digital trade estimates, and we need much more of that type of work as we go forward. And then we can start talking about, okay, which of the parts of digital regulation are the ones that are the biggest problem from a sort of cross-border commerce point of view, and then we can see there. So again, please don't. What I would suggest to you and to colleagues is just because you see policy diverging doesn't necessarily mean that there's a big trade problem, or you know, we should focus on where there are big trade policy problems caused by policy divergence. But the existence of divergence itself is an important fact, but figuring out where that divergence creates harm to other countries' trading interests that's where the real hard work has to be done. Yeah, we can't short circuit this process.
I agree. And I mean, yeah, so that's also, I mean, if I may, like one of my theses that a lot more research, empirical research needs to be done. All to say is, I mean, yeah, these issues, I mean, despite being wide apart, could be resolved potentially, yeah. Okay, so I also have a question coming in that I also wanted to ask in more or less the same terms, but I give priority to this question. The title of the book includes reference to the new WTO Director General, but the role of the DG itself hasn't been touched upon in the discussion. Not yet. I was about to come to that. Could you speak a little bit to that and the new implications of this role in current environment? And also, when can we expect to see the selection process talks restarting again following the Biden inauguration? How high will that be on the agenda? And do you expect, as a third follow-up question, the new administration, the Biden administration, to endorse the new appointed or supposedly appointed DG?
All right, so let's deal with those questions in reverse order, because the questions get easier as you went down the list. I think it's an easy short-term win for the Biden administration to accept Dr. Ngozi as the next DTG. And I'm not sure that they need to think too hard about this or to ruminate too carefully about this in order to come to that decision. So, you know, if we heard in the next 6 weeks that the US was happy with going ahead with Dr. Ngozi, I would not be at all surprised. And largely because it's a decision which doesn't really, I think, adversely harm US interests. I mean, Dr. Ngozi is a very known commodity in the US. She holds a US passport after all. So I think this is low-hanging fruit and a very easy way in which the Biden administration could signal that they are interested in seeing the WTO getting back on its feet. So I think that deals with the last two questions that you asked. The really tough question, well, it's not even tough. The interesting question, the super interesting question is the first question. The role of the DG, because here we did have quite a lot to say about this in the book. The first third of the book, which is on the first section of the book, which has chapters on how the WTO could better react to the crisis. It's interesting rereading those chapters, how the role of the DG, Director General, is one which people think could be a lot more active than was the case in the past 12 months. And there's a strong sense that the processes of supporting monitoring and deliberation by WTO members could be strengthened, and that resources should be reallocated within the Secretariat to doing that, that the WTO Director General should be much more in touch with other international organizations whose decisions and members influence enormously trade flows. So, for example, let's take the COVID crisis. Clearly, international trade was seriously curtailed by public health response measures, transportation-related measures, port restrictions, airport restrictions, restrictions on crews, and all the rest of it. So what we learned there is that there's a lot of supporting decisions which are needed in order for world trade to flow in all of its different forms, and the WTO does not control all of them. So the WTO Director General really needs to be at the forefront in bringing together the different organizations there and encouraging governments to take the least restrictive measures. So that's a much more active and open role. One of our chapter authors also argued that the WTO Director General should be there to convene trade ministers on a more frequent basis during crises, to be able to share ideas on how they're responding to try and sort of unwind unfortunate trade restrictions like the export curbs on medical equipment that we saw last year. And so I think there is a sense that under the previous Director General of the WTO, the pendulum swung far too much towards passivity. Okay? And of course, in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised because the previous Director General was an ambassador to the WTO, and the WTO ambassadors chose one of their own. And if you want to be tough about this, you would say those ambassadors chose someone who was liked, smart, able, but was not going to rock the boat. Okay, and so that's why when Mr. Azevedo stepped down, a number of us argued that we needed a heavy hitter, someone who is willing to bash heads together and also to be persuasive. There's only so far a DG can go in this. I don't think they're necessarily transformative, but someone like Dr. Ngozi has a reputation for being someone who can get people to work together. And the very fact that she has not been marinating in Geneva for years is, for me, actually an advantage of her over others.
Very good. I have a last question. So as we are sort of approaching the end of this discussion, and again, if other people want to come in with questions that are related to any of the questions, but also the following question that I asked, please do come in. I mean, we had some questions that could not yet be answered, but I think most of them have touched upon the same topics that I've discussed so far. As I said in the introduction, I mean, there are 21 chapters. Each chapter has very relevant proposals. And there are many proposals. I mean, if you count, I think there was sort of more than 80 proposals. Surely, I mean, we cannot implement them all. I mean, the new Director General cannot sort of, go ahead with all of them at the same time. I mean, there will be a lot. Mm-hmm. Put them differently, I mean, or ask the question differently. I mean, what then, I mean, are the sort of, let's say, 3-4 proposals that needs most sort of highest priority? What is the most urgent proposal that you have come across in the book that needs to be executed, done?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to answer it in a certain way. I think we need a proposal in each of the following 3 areas. Right? One is a proposal or initiative which helps demonstrate that WTO members and governments in an organization can take trade policy actions which will support the recovery from the pandemic. Yes. And so under that category, I would list having a memorandum of understanding on trade and medical goods. I would have very close monitoring of vaccine nationalism in all of its different forms, and also deliberations amongst WTO members about how to faster distribute vaccines and scale up the production of them. Yeah. So that's package 1. Package 2, this organization, the WTO, has got to start working together again. I mean, the amount of work which has taken place at the WTO was severely cut by the lack of face-to-face meetings. It's true, some meetings have gone on digital and that format, but there's a lot more that was identified in the ebook where the WTO could respond to crises. And indeed, I would argue that a new Director General should be thinking about developing a crisis management protocol so that this organization gears up as fast as the WHO gears up when there's a pandemic. The WTO needs to be gearing up when there's a global economic crisis. So the second, there needs to be an initiative there to show that this organization, the WTO, can better adjust to crises, since they seem to happen much more frequently these days. And then the third package is there has to be a down payment on the WTO's on rules which are going to become more and more important as the world economy evolves. So we've talked about the spread of digital trade, digitalization. We've talked about climate change. In either one of these areas, and probably in digital trade because there's already an initiative there ought to be some type of short-term win which signals to prime ministers and presidents that the WTO isn't stuck in the 20th century. So if we had a win in each of these three areas, helping the world economy recover from COVID, building up the crisis management capabilities of the WTO, and relevance, a win that showed the relevance of the WTO for the 21st century, this would be a package which, if we accomplish this in the next 12 to 18 months, we would all be talking about the WTO in a very different way.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so I think we have, dealt most of the sort of pressing issues. There's one last question that came in, and that I think is also worth discussing. In order to find a solution and to go ahead and to get things work, I mean, it comes a bit back to sort of the like-mindedness or finding a common purpose, or I mean, what one of the listeners are asking, like, some of these countries, I mean, they move ahead plurilaterally, and there has been sort of a corner of this sort of policy debate about this, the plurilateral. But at the same time, this listener is asking, like, wouldn't that harm others? I mean, wouldn't that sort of this double pace sort of advancement? Wouldn't that sort of more divide the organization in sort of the medium, in the long term?
I think the answer to that question is yes and no, and much depends on how our plurilateral is structured. I mean, clearly, what we do not want is countries undertaking measures which liberalize trade between a group of them and raise barriers against others, right? So there's a clear sense that we don't want plurilaterals to create adverse knock-on effects for non-members. Yeah, so and that's why we have these discussions about critical mass measure agreements versus other types of plurilaterals. I see, quite frankly, plurilaterals as being almost certainly inevitable, and so we need to think about how best to structure them. Now, of course, the countries that don't want to join plurilaterals, even if they're assured that their current interests are not affected, may be worried that rules are being set or templates for rules are being set, which will then be generalized. Now, there's two things to say to those countries. Well, of course, the rules can't be generalized without their consent, right? But the other thing is that in each of the areas that we've been talking about, digital economy, climate change and the like, every government's going to have to take some type of stance on the policies that it wants. In which case, and since these issues are relatively nascent, then I think that's a good reason why all the big players should be in on the discussion about what those rules should be. Even if ultimately they don't agree to join a plurilateral, they should be engaging in this area. It's inconceivable that countries won't have policies in this area. Yeah. So sort of thinking through what those policies could be and how to design them in a way which is least harmful to trading partners and yet meets the social imperative which is driving the regulation in question. I mean, this is what countries need to do. So again, I think with plurilaterals, yeah, you can paint you can paint horror stories if you want to, but on the other hand, I have enough faith in the creativity and the sort of flexibility of trade negotiators to come up with variants which are less or not damaging at all to trading partners. And I think that's, and one has to bear that in mind too. So be aware of the downside, okay, but work towards plurilaterals which are far more accommodating of non-members' interests.
Yeah. Okay, one final question for 1 minute, Simon, and then we wrap up. That is coming in here. What should we then expect of the RTAs? I mean, are they supporting then this multilateralism that we are talking about? Like, are they supporting this revitalizing of the WTO multilateralism, or are they more forming a threat? Also, maybe in light of these bigger agreements that have been signed recently.
I think given how low tariff barriers are in many countries now, it's harder and harder to argue that the creation of RTAs or indeed mega RTAs is going to have that much trade diversionary effect. To the extent that RTAs can't start covering more and more behind the border measures, and they are, and to the extent that those regulatory obligations are implemented on an MFN basis, even though they're part of a RTA, then there's less to worry about there. Okay, I tend to be honest with you, I think we as analysts have dramatically overstated the importance of RTAs, and I don't want to underplay them. And there are some RTAs and some in regional integration, like the ones we have in Europe, which have gone incredibly far. And they're and I would not want to put all RTAs in the same bucket, but many RTAs are fairly shallow. They're dealing with trading goods where tariffs now are already relatively low. And almost all of the new issues which are coming up are going to be ones dealing with behind the border policies. And there, most countries do not want to have two types of regulatory regime. Who wants to have two regulatory regimes for their big tech firms? One for RTA partners and one for others? That doesn't make any sense. So there's, I think, more and more of the logic of the behind the border measures points to MFN-based implementation, whether it's in the context of an RTA or not, in which case I think there's less of a traditional fear that we would have. So again, details matter in all of these areas. I don't want to deny that. But when you look at the bigger picture, I'm not losing that much sleep over RTAs.
Okay, well said. Okay, so we're coming on to an end here. It's 2017. I think we have covered all of the issues. I think that all of it is extremely important in the book, of course, and a fascinating read, very nice. But we have tried to cover the most important ones that you notably have pointed out in the introduction. Again, I would recommend everybody to read the book, Revitalizing Multilateralism, Pragmatic Ideas for the New WTO Director General, that hopefully will come in soon. Thank you very much, Simon, for discussing with us. Thank you and your colleague, Richard Baldwin, for writing the book. Thank you, listeners, for being here today and to have a good amount of questions. And hopefully, until the next webinar. All right.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.